Good evening, everyone, and very warm welcome to you all. So this our fourth in a series of 5 lectures on art within cathedrals. My name is Laura Moffat, and I'm the Director of Art and Christianity, and a really special warm welcome to anybody who hasn't been to one of our events before or who might be new to art and Christianity. I hope you'll enjoy this evening and might take a moment to have a look at our website and see what else we do. We produce a journal. We've just got the brand new issue hot off the press here this evening, and we also put on events like this, but we also work with artists. We're currently just hosting an exhibition in Leytonstone, not far away from where I am now, which is an interfaith exhibition between a Hindu temple and the Christian church. That's on until the 17th of July, and we'd love you to come out to Leytonstone. It's just a short hop on the central line, so do please come and see that if you can. I think it just remains for me to introduce Dominic, who you can see on your screens here. Thank you, Dominic, for joining us from Liverpool. Dominic is the Principal Lecturer in Architecture at John Moores University, offices right next to Liverpool Met Cathedral, and so he I think you could almost say he sort of lives and breathes it, I guess. You know, at a drop of a hat he can be in there and be in that wonderful space. I feel really excited about this talk. I should be totally impartial about these talks, but this is one of the ones I've been really looking forward to, having spent a lot of my teenage years in a town close to Liverpool and visiting the cathedral many times, and just well, I think I could say it's actually been quite formative for me personally. Dominic's also co-author of a fantastic new book, I want to point out, on the architect F.X. Velarde. Many of you may not know that name. He's not particularly a household name, but he has some brilliant case studies in here of churches, again, probably mostly in the Northwest, but fantastic Catholic architect of the 20th century, and a really wonderful accessible book with some great images as well in there. So I think I'll just hand over now to Dominic, who's going to hopefully screen share and take us through his talk, and then we'll come to some questions at the end. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you, Laura. Well, let me just set this up as the right. Great, there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. So thank you, Laura, and it's thank you for the invite to come and do this talk. Always happy to talk about Catholic architecture, and as you say, particularly a building that is less than a stone's throw from where I normally work. Obviously not in lockdown, I'm working from home, but otherwise. I'm an architect and a university lecturer, and I sort of got more interested in the Metropolitan Cathedral. I've always, since I came to Liverpool as a student, I've lived very close to it in the Georgian Quarter. But back in 2016, I was asked by a friend who's one of the friends of the cathedral if I would get involved in putting together an exhibition based around the entries for the architectural competition in 1959-1960, which I did, and we put on researched and put on an exhibition as part of the celebrations in 2017 at the cathedral. And following on from that, I became more involved through sitting on the Art and Architecture Advisory panel that the cathedral has set up. It's an important thing, the Art and Architecture Advisory panel within the cathedral, because there are, whilst the building is absolutely wonderful and spectacular and has some superb artwork in it, that creates its own problems, which will hopefully come to light really as we go through the talk, and I explain the restrictions that are incumbent upon the Dean and Chapter in being custodians of such an important piece of modernist architecture. So that's the sort of background to how I got involved in it. And as Laura says, I've then followed that up with a book with a colleague, Andrew Crompton from Liverpool University, on the work of Velarde, who incidentally was at one point asked to undertake the design of the Metropolitan Cathedral, but I'll come on to that in the talk. So if I move on, so the way I'm going to structure this evening's talk is a little bit of background. These things never arrive easily, and there was quite a long and troubled gestation period for the Metropolitan Cathedral, and I'll take you through that, and ending in really the competition in 1959 to select the design of the building that now stands there. We'll then talk about Gibberd's winning entry and the various sort of architectural components of that. And then moving into the artworks that are embedded in this. The title of the series is Art Within Cathedrals, and this a great deal of the images will be around the artworks that are there. Initially, the ones that were conceived of as contemporary with the design of the cathedral by Gibberd and the Cathedral Committee. And then with some later additions, which highlight some of the ongoing issues that the cathedral faces in how to manage this legacy. So that will be the structure. So, starting off. This is a slide of St. Nicholas's Church, which used to be on Copperas Hill, or Hawk Street actually, but just off Copperas Hill, in the centre of Liverpool. Demolished in the 1980s. This served as the pro-cathedral for until the completion of the current Metropolitan Cathedral. It wasn't really intended to be even the pro-cathedral. It was simply a parish church that became appropriated. After the Catholic Church was allowed to have a hierarchy and bishoprics in the 1850s, the Bishop of Liverpool at the time asked Fusion, not Augustus Welby, his son, to design a cathedral for the city, and the site was identified out in St. Domingo Road, up on Everton Brow, and work started. Some of the side chapel, one of the side chapels was built and completed, which then went on to be cut, but the work was abandoned. The side chapel becoming the parish church of Our Lady Immaculate. Before that was itself demolished, again in the 1980s, I think. So this operated, despite this early attempt to build a cathedral for Liverpool, the diocese was left with St. Nicholas's parish church effectively as the pro-cathedral. This actually is a relatively early building, 1813. It's not the earliest Catholic church in Liverpool. That goes to St. Peter's in Seal Street, 1783, I think. Part of the reason that Liverpool had such early pre-Emancipation Act Catholic churches was that it was a port, and you would have lots of Catholics travelling through the city. And so earlier Catholic churches were allowed and tolerated, so long as they looked fairly plain. And St. Peter's was designed to look like a house initially. So St. Peter's predates this, and St. Nicholas here is very similar in its form to St. Anthony's on Scotland Road. So there's this clutch of quite early Catholic churches in Liverpool, which testify to the fact that there was a large Catholic population before the potato famine in the 1840s led to massive Irish immigration into the city. So people often think that that's the point at which the sort of Catholic population of Liverpool was established, but no, it was well established before then. What it did do, however, was it provided the impetus which led to the proposal to build the cathedral in St. Domingo Road, which obviously is abandoned. So for a long time then, after that notions of a new cathedral were put on ice, until in 1928, Bishop Downey became Archbishop of Liverpool, and he set about building what he called a cathedral in our time. In 1930, the Archdiocese purchased the site of the Liverpool Workhouse, which had been the largest workhouse in the country and was located on a very prominent site at the end of Hope Street, on the ridge that defines the sort of edge of the eastern edge of Liverpool city centre. This was an inspired choice of the site, very lofty position, close to the city centre, closer than the Anglican Cathedral, which was rising out of the ground at the time on the St James's Mount at the other end of Hope Street. But it was a rather windy location, which the cathedral has to live with consequences of that. Archbishop Downey offered the commission directly to Sir Edwin Lutyens. There was no competition, invited or public or open. He simply asked him if he would design the cathedral, which he naturally said yes. Lutyens' designs were exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1932, and this model, known as the Great Model, was commissioned in 1933, ostensibly to help raise funds. This enormous building was going to be paid for by the donations of the ordinary working class citizens of Catholic citizens of Liverpool, and they delved deeply into their pockets to help fund it. Work started in 1933, about the time the model was built, on the crypt. You can't really see the crypt in the model, but you will see it in a later image. So, and work continued on the crypt, and here you can see some of Lutyens' quite intricate stonework detailing, and brickwork, granite and brick were the main materials. Work continued until 1939, when obviously the Second World War put a stop to construction work. One bricklayer did, I believe, carry on working on the site right the way through the war, and slowly adding another brick to the millions that were already in there. Lutyens died in 1944, and shortly afterwards, Valadi, who I wrote about, was asked if he would complete Lutyens' scheme. He politely, and he had to be very polite because the Archdiocese was his principal client, declined. And he declined on 3 grounds, which he laid out in his diaries. One was the reputational aspect of being seen to have your major piece of life's work completing someone else's design. Another one was that he was nervous about being a local man designing a building with the committee, that he wouldn't be given a free hand on it. And finally, that the cost, he considered it poor form to spend so much money on a cathedral. The costs had been spiraling and spiraling, when there was so much else that needed to be done in terms of schools and housing. So he declined. Archbishop Downey himself died in 1953, which really took the impetus out of the Lutyens scheme finally. Shortly afterwards, Adrian Gilbert Scott, Charles Gilbert Scott's brother, was asked to produce a much slimmed down, a fraction of the cost version of the Lutyens scheme. What he produced is what could be described as a Palladian country house with a massive dome stuck on top of it. It's not a great piece of design. It's not really, to be fair, a reflection on Adrian Gilbert Scott, who was a very accomplished church architect, but rather that it was a poisoned chalice of a brief, to try and keep something of Lutyens' grandeur, which primarily involved the dome, at such a massively reduced budget would inevitably lead to a very simple base with the dome stuck on top, which is exactly what he produced. It was widely criticised in the architectural press at the time, and at that point, Lutyens, or even slimmed down versions of Lutyens' scheme, were finally abandoned. Archbishop Downey's successor, Archbishop Heenan, in 1959, decided to set about the process again, to start from scratch. And unlike his predecessor with Lutyens, this was not going to be a tap on the shoulder to a preferred architect. This was going to be an open international competition. All British architects or architects registered in Commonwealth countries were eligible to enter. And the competition terms and conditions were released in 1939, and 298 practices entered, or individuals entered. And these are the conditions of that. Now, there's an interesting, here's the jury. So, sorry, first of all, the competition called for the terms and conditions, which were essentially a rip-off of the terms and conditions from Coventry Cathedral, as it was the only recently completed British cathedral, so that was adopted as the terms and conditions. The brief called for a congregation of 3,000 to be accommodated within 80 feet of the altar on a budget of £1 million. Now, the 80 feet of an altar is an important aspect to this. So here's the jury. Sorry, it's a very grainy image, taken out as a very small magazine image, this one. But it's the jury, Archbishop Heenan himself, Sir Basil Spence, obviously still finishing off Coventry at this stage, who was chair, which is probably why the Coventry terms and conditions were used. He simply gave the cathedral a copy of the terms and conditions, and sort of cut out the word Coventry and replace it with the word Liverpool. And David Stokes, who was a technical advisor appointed, nominated by the RIBA to sit on the panel. Not in the image is Canon McKenna, who was very critical as the sort of liaison. He was the committee secretary, and he was the liaison between the building committee and the jury. And there's some interesting correspondence in the archive at the cathedral at the time that the conditions were being put together. And I'll read from one particular letter that's quite telling, and it's from Cardinal Heenan to David Stokes, and he says, "I'm wondering if the expression 'competitors are reminded that this is a cathedral to be built in the second half of the 20th century' is really necessary. It could be interpreted as a direction not to build in a traditional style. Whilst personally I think it will have to be quite a modern style, I wonder if such a direction should be given." So, ever the diplomat, what Cardinal Heenan is clearly saying is, well, we know it's going to be a modern solution, we know it's going to be a contemporary design, but we can't really appear to prejudge the outcome. And there were still plenty of traditionalists within the chapter of the cathedral who would like to see a more traditional long nave type approach, as was adopted at Coventry or obviously at Westminster. You see this then in the images, the schemes that are actually shortlisted. So of the 20-odd shortlisted schemes, or commended schemes, the majority were either centralised plans or fan-shaped plans. And the point about the 80 feet of the altar, getting 3,000 people within 80 feet of the altar cannot be done with a long nave. It's simply the technical requirement of the competition brief precluded a traditional scheme. One or two traditional schemes were included in the shortlist, again, I suspect for political reasons. The selection of a centralised plan, however, was quite an interesting point of time in the development of Catholic Church architecture. So, in reverse order, third place by Ansell and Bailey, architects in Manchester. They're still going as a practice now. I'm based solely in London, I think. And this is a scheme that's a bit of a hybrid. It has allusions to a nave, but it also has a centralised altar under the crossing. It has shallow side chapels directed towards the altar, but it's a slightly muddled kind of plan, neither traditional nor contemporary. The story behind how I got these images is quite an interesting one. When I was doing the competition exhibition, I eventually managed to get in contact with one of the partners at the practice and asked him if they had any drawings. And he said, oh yes, he said, I've had those drawings under my desk for 50 years and I threw them out yesterday. Thankfully, he had taken some rather grainy photographs on his phone. So that's why we have these images. The second place scheme is quite an amazing scheme by C.H.R. Bailey from Singapore. And it's this kind of Alessi orange squeezer, which you see on the left there. A centralized form, but with a fan-shaped plan, with the altar offset, very much in the fashion of, say, Dominicus Balm's centralized plan in Cologne, with, I forget the name of the church now in Cologne, from the 1930s, where this similar plan form was adopted of a central form, but with an asymmetrically placed altar, which allows for a fan-shaped congregation. Again, the side chapels arranged around the circle, very much in the manner of Gibberd's winning scheme. You can see on the left that it's kind of got it's also got a little bit of the Sydney Opera House about it, and it would have probably been equally difficult and expensive to build. And this brings up an important point about perhaps why Gibberd's scheme was selected. And Gibberd accepts this himself when he writes about his design, that he probably would not have won, but for the fact that the assessors also had technical advisors that included quantity surveyors and structural engineers, and that the £1 million budget and the ability to actually build it with contemporary technology were important factors. So clearly, Archbishop Heenan was anxious not to follow the path of his predecessor in having costs and the potential to realise this run away from him. So, on to the winning scheme. So here we go, Frederick Gibberd's building as we see it. The jury apparently arrived very quickly at the decision. The 298 schemes, eight A1 boards per competitor, were hung on scaffolding in the Ursuline convent in Wimbledon. Only the nuns were allowed to see them in advance. And then the jury went in, and the winner was announced on, I think it was the 15th of August, 1960, on the live on the BBC Today programme. And this is the winning scheme by Sir Frederick Gibberd. Model on the left and the plan on the right. You can see some subtle but important differences between the competition winning entry and the cathedral as built. The lantern, for instance, in the model is far more tapered on the original competition scheme. It becomes much more vertical in its emphasis as built. The belfry and porch to the right of the on the model changes shape quite prominently from a pyramid into a wedge. And in the plan, and these are quite difficult to pick out, but interestingly, the baptistry moves on the competition entry. It's to the left of the entrance, it moves to the right. The side chapels running around the edge of the perimeter of the nave are far more varied in their form and shape and plan layout in the competition entry. The scheme was finally built. To help keep the costs down, the requirement for 3,000 was dropped down to 2,000. So it's actually a smaller church. And interestingly, in the competition, you can see, although the sanctuary is absolutely central, the altar is actually placed slightly asymmetrically within the sanctuary. There is the various presbyteries and other archdiocesan offices in this scheme are arranged on the edges of the Lutyens' podium, which is off to the left of the plan. And these obviously, as built, move to the off the podium and onto the green space on the top, off the top edge of this plan. The original competition always envisaged a grand flight of winning entry, always envisaged a grand flight of stairs coming up from Hope Street. Although this took a great number of years to realise, because the university had a building that was in the way, that it took them rather a long time to relocate. So the influence, at the same time that Gibberd was entering this competition, he was also designing this chapel for the De La Salle College, now Hopwood College, in Middleton in Manchester, which is another centrally planned church, somewhat octagonal, under a sort of much more slimmed down version of the lantern at Liverpool. And here the altar is not symmetrical. Here the altar is as with the second place scheme, CHR Bailey's, the altar is asymmetrical. Simultaneously, St. Mary's Leyland by Wakeman and Bullen, well, in fact, by Jerzy Fijinski, the Polish architect who was working at Wakeman and Bullen at the time, was being built. It was opened in 1960. And really what all these things come together to do is to mark a very particular point in time in the development of Catholic Church architecture, when circular or near circular, centrally planned churches with centrally placed altars were popular. This was not a period that lasted for very long, despite the upcoming Second Vatican Council and the changes to the form of celebration of Mass, which would lead to a great deal of reordering of more traditional churches. The circular plan had a number of difficulties with it, which were very quickly became apparent. And by the end of the certainly by the middle end of the 1960s, circular centrally planned churches were giving way to more fan-shaped ones. And at Clifton Cathedral in Bristol, we see a fan-shaped plan. So this also all points to the importance of the cathedral at this transition point between the nave and the fan. Oh, just sorry, as an aside here, you can't quite make them out, but the Stations of the Cross at St. Mary's Leyland are by Arthur Dooley, the Liverpool sculptor, who we'll come back to later. Now, Gibberd's scheme was affordable, it was technically achievable, it met the brief requirements for the congregation distance from the altar. Importantly, he raised his building up to the level of Lutyens crypt, to the top of the podium on the top of Lutyens crypt, which gave relatively small cathedral extra height. And this was important in the skyline of Liverpool. So there were some very good entries by people like Sir Dennis Lasdom, which had excellent plan forms, but didn't have the presence on the skyline. And I think that was an important point in the jury's sort of assessment. You know, they were very acutely aware that at the other end of Hope Street was an enormous, monumental and very prominent Anglican church going on. Now Gibberd, who was Anglican, was at the time was the Oscar Niemeyer's church in the cathedral in Brasilia was being constructed, and a great number of people sort of commented on the similarity. Gibberd got very upset about this because actually the similarities are entirely superficial. The thing that was far more likely the inspiration for Liverpool is the octagon, the lantern at Ely Cathedral, and here you can see a view of that internally, and the structural model. And you can start to see how the ribs and the various ring beams relate to the work that Gibberd, to the designs that Gibberd put together for Liverpool. And here you can see on the left, Gibberd's initial structural solution, which did not have the flying buttresses that have become so iconic an element of the cathedral. And this is really how he had the cathedral in his head, which is clearly much more about Ely and far less about Brasilia. It is made up out of a concrete frame, and you can see on the left the sections are quite chunky. The structural engineer, James Lowe, suggested the addition of the flying buttresses. Gibberd was always slightly reticent about that decision, but he went with it because what it enabled him to do was slim down greatly the ring beams and the verticals, and you can see the comparison of the two sections there. This helped with cost, so it's just a far more efficient structural system by having the flying. Flipped now to the right-hand side of the entrance. You're entering on the liturgical west end is actually at the south end of this. So when I refer to north, south, east, and west, I'll refer to the liturgical orientation rather than the geographical one. So the liturgical west end, which faces Hope Street, and you come up through an entrance port, which is deliberately a compression space. It has two parts to it. You should come through into a tall section and then go into a very low section, very horizontal section. And this is a deliberate architectural device, a Baroque device really, for creating a compression zone before you enter into the main cathedral, and it heightens the sense of scale when you enter into the main space. The altar is placed centrally. There are two side entrances, the north and south porches, and then there is the choir and the Blessed Sacrament Chapel behind the altar. And this is one of the problems that I mentioned about a secular plan. Things are behind the altar. So a lot of the congregation are distracted. There's activity behind the altar rather than simply the rear wall in a more traditional plan form. It also means that potentially the further round you go from the entrance, the more you're facing the side of the priest delivering the service rather than what would have been the priest facing the congregation. So it creates some problems that way as well. So it's always that difficulty. What do you put behind the altar that's not going to distract attention? Gibberd put the choir and the organ, and they do create it avoids the problem of the congregation being there, but it doesn't get away from the problem of sort of visual cacophony behind the altar. On the right, you can see the plan as built. So the other thing that was dropped from, apart from the size getting smaller, the competition entry had a dished floor. It had a shallow dished floor, which was designed to improve sight lines. That was dropped on two grounds, really. One, that it was expensive to make, and the other that it was felt that it made it a little bit like an auditorium. And the cathedral committee were anxious that this is a church, it's not an auditorium. So that was eliminated. And you can see how the side chapels have become much simpler in this version. And here's the cathedral in construction, with the very prominent flying buttresses. This is before the lantern goes up, and you can see the top ring beam and the crane, the centrally placed crane coming out of the middle, which was a spectacular piece of construction management. To the left of this, you can see a sort of L-shaped building, which was the university building. I think it was nuclear physics, that for many years prevented the installation of the main entrance steps to the west front. To the right, you can see the part of Lutyens' crypt that was completed below its podium. There's a large rectangle just immediately to the right of the cathedral itself. Beyond that is actually a fragment of the old workhouse building in the bottom right-hand corner of the image, which was only demolished, I think, about 10 years ago by Liverpool University. And then here we go, nearing completion. I'm afraid I can't tell you who the gentleman in the image are, although I think some of the people here, someone else here might be able to illuminate us on that. And there you can see the view internally from one of the TV galleries. This was a modern cathedral. It was designed to make allowance for the fact that services may be televised, and there were two elevated galleries created, which TV cameras could utilise to get a better shot of the services. You can see here I'll talk later about the pews and the floor and the altar itself. The one thing that's missing on this that was on the original was the altar rail, which although this was a very modern church, it was built, or it was certainly designed before the Second Vatican Council concluded, and so it did have originally a very slender, incredibly slender altar rail, which has since been removed. So there's the building. Now, what about what goes into it? So one of the things that Gibberd mentions in his book about the cathedral is that up to this point, the decisions were his, really, because he was simply following what had won the competition. The tweaks could be made and were made, but essentially the design was not argued with. But then you get to a point where you have to add the detail to this scheme, to fit it out, to add the flesh to the bones. I mean, those things were not defined in the competition winning entry. And so this then became areas for discussion and much more debate between the design team, artists and craftsmen, and the cathedral committee. And here you can see, and I'm going to take you through this. I'll start externally and then move internally. with the selection of artists that worked on this was very carefully considered, and Gibberd had a very strong hand in this, but he didn't have an entirely free hand. So you see the carved Calvary crosses on the Great West Front with the bells above them, looking down the sort of linear, the great axis of Hope Street. These were designed by Bill Mitchell. And now Bill Mitchell was an extremely prolific sculptor, modernist sculptor, only died, I think, last year or maybe the year before. No, I think doing last year. His biographer, I remember his biographer explaining at a conference once how, and the book on him was only completed a couple of years ago. Bill Mitchell had done so much work that he completely forgot half the things that he'd done, and then he claimed credit for things that he hadn't done. So he didn't really keep a very detailed catalogue. But here's another local example of Bill Mitchell's work that's still there. And I love this image from the art school archive at John Moores, of some of the fashion students in front of the concrete panels designed by Bill Mitchell that sit on what was Federation House on Hope Street. It's now a cafe and a drama school. This is very typical of Bill Mitchell's work, very expressive, deeply modelled concrete work, often with quite fluid, these sort of linear fluid forms. So his work for the West Front of the Cathedral is quite restrained by Bill Mitchell standards. There's another great example of his work on the front of the Turnpike Gallery in Lee, outside Manchester. So on the left there is Bill Mitchell's maquette for the Calvary crosses. And on the right is the one of the team who were charged with finishing this off. Now, part of the reason that this is more restrained than Bill Mitchell's other work is cost. Gibberd was very conscious of the cost of the building. And with Mitchell, he discussed how this could be done in such a way that the crosses could, the Portland stone that the crosses are made from, could largely be carved by machine. That could be machine worked. In reality, they did some of the work was automated, but actually they found to their horror that most of it was still too intricate and had to be finished off by hand. So they didn't really make any savings on it. The other main Bill Mitchell element that we see in the cathedral are the west front doors. And here they are. And they look like your typical cast bronze, very, very heavy cathedral doors. They slide open and they're not bronze. They're actually fiberglass with a bronze fiber, a bronze dust in the fiberglass mix to give it a bronzed finish. So you go and tap them and they're actually hollow. And then you can see them open. Obviously a recent photograph because you've got coronavirus warning stickers on the windows. Closed, open. Again, this is much more typical of Mitchell's work, and it's expressive of the four apostles are symbolized within these doors. Often overlooked are the north and south porch doors, also by Mitchell, far more subtle. This is the north porch, and there's a real intricate detail to these that is perhaps overpowered on the west front ones. And if you visit the cathedral, I'd urge you to sort of walk around the podium and have a look at these doors. They're every bit as beautiful as the much better known west front ones. And there's the south porch. And there's some of the very expressive detail of the surface in fiberglass. And now coming into the building, coming into the church. Once you come through the entrance porch with its compression space, this is the view that greets you as you step through the inner doors of the lobby. It's impressive. It's meant to be impressive and it works. You get a very clear and instant sense of the total space in this instance with the scaffolding up to the organ behind the altar. So that's slightly non-typical image of it. One of the things that comes across from this is the light, the colour, and the effect of the coloured glass on the interior. I'll talk about that in a second. This is both a power and also a weakness in the way of the cathedral. It's impressive instant hit, but actually in the 1967 Architectural Review kind of critique of the building at its opening, the author Nicholas Taylor pointed out that this then runs the risk of it being a one-liner. And that's not totally fair, to be honest. It's not a one-liner. There's plenty of subtlety and other layers. But you do get that there aren't many surprises, spatial surprises. Spatially, the building is instantly perceivable, unlike the Anglican counterpart, which has lots of more intricate spatial promenades and sequences in it. One of the other criticisms that Nicholas Taylor makes in the Architectural Review article is of the acoustic render to some of the side chapel walls, which serves to dematerialize the scale of the building. So again, at the Anglican Cathedral, the coursing lines of the stonework help you to gauge distance and size, whereas that's denied here by the uniform nature of the acoustic plaster. The glass is one of the most important aspects of the cathedral, and it's something that most visitors do comment upon. And in selecting the glass and the artists of the glass, Gibberd and the committee, Gibberd didn't have a free hand at this point. This was the point of transition in the design between the architectural scheme and the integration with artists in negotiation with the committee. And so they went to visit both Coventry Cathedral and this church, St. Fatima in Harlow, by Gerald Golan, which contained a massive amount of Dalle de Verre glass by Dom Charles Norris. Now, Dalle de Verre, sorry, I misspelled it there, there's a missing L in Dalle de Verre. Dalle de Verre glass was developed in the 1930s in France, and it was brought to the UK by Pierre Formanteau, I think, I can't never pronounce his name, in the 1950s. And Dom Charles Norris, who did the glass at St. Fatima's, was a pupil of his. And this was the first extensive use of Dalle de Verre in the UK, and it's you're only talking a couple of years ahead of Liverpool here. And essentially, for Dalle de Verre means slab glass, and it's essentially about 3 centimetre thick chunks of glass, coloured glass, that are set into either resin or concrete mix. And that then forms large panels, which can then be assembled into a frame. It is not stained glass. Stained glass is a very different sort of process. It's heavy, it's chunky, but it gives the opportunity for quite abstract patterns and quite large areas of glass. It's potentially stronger in itself as a panel than a stained glass panel with the leaded canes would be. The artists that were chosen were John Piper and Piper and Reyntiens, who had both worked on the glass at Coventry Cathedral, which was stained glass, not Dalle de Verre. But when they came to work on Liverpool, it was decided that it would be Dalle de Verre, because you needed that to cover the large areas of glazing that were envisaged. And here you can see an image of Reyntiens and Piper laying out the cartoons for the fabrication of the Dalle de Verre panels for the lantern on the floor of Henley Town Hall. That's because John Piper lived in the village of Forley, just outside Henley. So that's why I used that. And here you can see the lantern, which was conceived of as a chromatic trinity, moving through the colour spectrum with 3 main emphases: blue, red, and yellow, forming a trinity above the altar. And you can see the panels are, the pattern of the glazing sort of ignores the ribs, the structural ribs of the lantern, and carries through all the way around. The mix that this was set in this as I'd mentioned before, a very windy location, also facing exposed to the winds coming off the Irish Sea, would lead to technical problems for the lantern, which I'll talk about at the end. And here you can see some details of the Piper and Reyntiens glass, and you get a sense of those thick glass slabs set into into the concrete and resin, concrete or resin kind of ribs framework. Now, not all the glass. People often think of the glass in the cathedrals all by Piper and Reyntiens. It's not. Quite all of the glass is by other artists. And these are some windows by Margaret Traherne, again contemporary with the cathedral. Obviously, couldn't be fitted afterwards. The Chapel of Reconciliation, which is the red glass, and the very subtle sandy brown colours of the Lady Chapel glass, both by Margaret Traherne. Actually, the red one I think is my favourite glass in the cathedral. And there's some more glass, and this one I think is stained glass rather than Dalle de Verre, although I stand to be corrected on that. I haven't looked that closely at it. And this is by Kerry Richards, and this is in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel behind the altar, on the opposite side of the altar from the entrance. And there were two triangular windows, and then a central reredos over the Blessed Sacrament altar. And these were seen as a trinity. Again, this was a triptych, like a spatial triptych, Kerry Richards described it as. Kerry Richards was a modernist artist, sort of not entirely abstract, but sort of abstract tendencies, very much in the similar way to, say, the Cornish artists, the St Ives group. But he was Welsh, and mainly painter, but he also worked in glass, and these are some examples of his glass work. And then here is a more typical piece of his a painting, in this case for the reredos behind the altar. He also designed the enclosure for the tabernacle enclosure, which is you see as the 3 panels within the frame, which is actually recessed into the rear wall of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. And you can't quite make it out on that shot, but the 2 windows sit immediately to the left and right of that canopy that sits over the altar. Some of the other contemporary artists, in a more traditional sort of providing the figurative elements within the cathedral. Here you have Robert Brumby, who designed the Madonna and Child. This was, he offered up a series of 3 or 4 maquettes to the committee, and this was the one that was selected to sit in the Lady Chapel, flanked by Margaret Traherne's glass. Gibberd was very keen here that the walls should be white in this space, and that it should be a lighter space. So he hides the concrete construction, the ribs that form up the walls are hidden behind the render, the acoustic render, and but then exposed again on the soffit, on the ceiling. There's a small pyramidal skylight over the Madonna and Child, but actually you can see here that the lighting doesn't quite come off in the view on the right. It may be my bad photography, of course, or it may be that simply the skylight is too far away, and the contrast to counter the contrast between the darkness of the walls and the light of the glass, the Traherne glass. So without the spotlights on, the Madonna and Child isn't that visible within the Lady Chapel. Another beautiful space in the cathedral is the baptistry. Again, you know, Gibberd was Anglican, not Catholic, and so he took a great deal of advice on this, and he was about the need to secure the cover of the font, about a need to secure the baptistry itself, and the form of the font was easy. He said it was simple. It was a piece of cylindrical marble, the same material used for the high altar. But there was a lot of debate about how to do the container for the holy water and the lid, and how to have the various components sort of operate. And actually what ends up with is a vessel within a vessel, sitting within the center of the font. And you can see this space, you can see perhaps more clearly on the left-hand side through the screen. There's a very diffuse light in this. So there's a very large skylight over the baptistry, but there's then an internal canopy that bounces the light, so you don't see the direct light. It's diffused through the space, and it gives a very nice, even white light. The doors are beautiful bronze sliding doors by David Atkins, and Liverpool City Council contributed, I think it was £10,000. They said, we'll give £10,000 towards the construction of the cathedral. And so it was decided to use that on these bronze doors. So these were paid for by the council. And there's a small, almost worn away inscription on the kind of lock plate. Another element that David Atkins was responsible for was the floor. And here is his layout plan for the floor, which extends from the entrance lobby on the right through the nave, the sanctuary, and into the more prominent porches and side chapels. And there's a little bit of the detail of the floor. The samples of this, the various marble and stone samples of this used to reside in the basement. They were pinned to the wall in the basement of the School of Architecture in Abercrombie Square at Liverpool University. And they periodically, one of them would disappear to become a student's chopping board. And here you can see how the floor interrelates with the pews in Douglas Fir by Frank Height. And these are actually far more cleverly designed than you would perhaps realise when you first go in. They just seem very simple. They are deeply uncomfortable, of course, but then it's not a theatre, you're not meant to be comfortable. And you can see, because you've got this circular shape, you've got these tapering fingers of the dark floor finish, the dark marble floor finish. And the distance between the uprights of each of the pews gets progressively smaller so that the legs stay within the dark zones on the floor. You can see that particularly on the right image. And now to the centre point of this, the kind of the high altar, an enormous piece of Skopje white marble, and I think it weighs 8 tons, and David Atkins floor pattern, focusing the attention upon it. The altarware was designed by Professor Gooden, very fine, simple silver. Gibberd was very keen that the candelabras stay short so as not to obscure the priest taking services. And there's a very, very, and again, this was contemporary, a very slender, elegant crucifix by Dame Elizabeth Frink. And so there's the detail of the crucifix on the right. She designed the crucifix, and then Gooden designed the timber, or actually, I'm not sure it's the metal shaft that it sits on. There is an anecdote about this. There's a slight kink in it, and apparently someone entered the cathedral a few years ago, picked it up, slung it over his shoulder, putting a little bend into the process, and proceeded to try to walk out. And thankfully, he was stopped. But that's why it's not quite straight anymore. And directly above this is Gibberd's Baldacchino, which is again a technical tour de force of speakers and light fittings suspended in this aluminium framework over the high altar. So it meets all the kind of technical requirements for lighting and providing acoustic support. Now externally, well, so that's not all of the contemporary artworks, so that's the major contemporary artworks with the cathedral. And you can see how Gibberd is working with the cathedral committee to select artworks that are modernist artworks, that are in tune with the architecture of the building. Now that was 50 years ago, and since then a lot of extra things have been added to the building. And again, starting externally, some of the more recent ones are the coloured glass steels around marking the entrance porches above. Ralph Seitz, who sadly died fairly recently, a well-known German stained glass, or not stained glass, coloured glass artist, is that right? And another piece is Still Point by Susanna Heron in the garden that was finally put in place as part of the completion of the grand steps to the west front. Internally, work has been added to the cathedral. It's a living cathedral, and Gibberd acknowledged that early on. He said that the idea was that some of the side chapels especially would provide quite neutral spaces that artwork could be added to. I think he was slightly disingenuous there, because actually the side chapels are quite difficult to add artwork to without compromising them, because they're very architecturally determined. But this is a statue of Abraham by Sean Rice, which sits in one of the apses to the side of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. Sean Rice also did the Stations of the Cross, which sit on the concrete rib, on the main concrete ribs located around the perimeter of the nave. Quite a successful location for them all. Tricky to light because they're seen against the very bright blue light of the coloured glass either side. Some other works, the George Mayer Martin's Pentecost mosaic, which was moved from a church in Netherton that was demolished and transferred to the cathedral. And this is one of the problems for the cathedral, is that the cathedrals become repositories for artworks that are salvaged from other churches. And in something that's such a single conception as Gibberd's Cathedral, it becomes very difficult to try and incorporate some of these. Another piece of later artwork is Arthur Dooley's diminutive but very powerful Risen Christ. Arthur Dooley was a great Liverpool character, a sculptor, former dock worker, and produced works that sit outside the St. Nicholas's Parish Church, Anglican Parish Church down on the waterfront at Liverpool, on the side of the Methodist Church in Princess Avenue, and also, as I mentioned earlier, the Stations of the Cross at St. Mary's Leyland. And here you can see his little Christ that was added in the 1980s in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. I think the Stations of the Sean Rice's Stations of the Cross and Arthur Dooley's figure of Risen Christ are very successful additions to the cathedral, and I'm sure Gibberd would have been very happy with that. I'm not convinced that every piece of subsequent artwork that's been added is quite as successful. St. Joseph's Chapel, lined in timber, with subsequent carvings by Stephen Foster, in a slightly sort of in a more figurative and country style, I suppose you'd describe it. I'm not sure this totally works with the abstraction of the Archbishop's tomb sat in front of it. But some of the most recent additions have been very beautifully handled, with elegant lighting and very much in the spirit of the building. And these are the Latin American saints, which sit just to the left of the main entrance. And this comes out of a connection between the cathedral and several Latin American countries. And Isabel Benavides, who did St. Martin de Porres, is from Lima in Peru. And then obviously St. Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of Nicaragua, was it? Correct me on that one. And this shows how contemporary and figurative artwork can be inserted into this very abstract modernist cathedral in a successful manner. Some of the other things that come up is that actually not everything that was put in originally is still there. The original Bishop's Throne on the left there, designed by Professor Russell, for a long time disappeared, and various other Bishop's Thrones sort of were substituted. Not, shall we say, always sympathetic to the artistic integrity of the cathedral. And recently, the Bishop's Throne has been resurrected. It was found sitting in a lobby, it was restored and reinstalled without its canopy, with a slightly different backing. But that's, I think, a nice idea that these elements are now coming back, and that there's appreciation of the quality of the original fittings. Simplistic though they may appear simple, but they are actually quite sophisticated and work with the language of the building. And here's the man himself, Frederick Gibberd, with his competition perspective. And on the left, the opening celebrations, which included dance performances and a very abstract and modernist music piece, which wasn't actually performed. They didn't have a chance to rehearse it before the actual opening ceremony, so it was only performed in 2017. With this idea that it wasn't just about static artworks, it was about active artwork, music, dance and performance, and things that bring people into the building, as well as objects. And that's the end of my talk. How am I doing on time? I'm slightly over, so thank you.
Thank you, Dominic.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. How wonderful. That's been such a brilliant story. And I'm sure lots of us will have appreciated all the detail you've gone into, the historical, well, the story of the building in its entirety, which is so interesting, as well as the details on the artworks. I can see questions clicking in here. One of the first questions that came through, and which I was also wondering, who was David Atkins? And he seems really interesting. Was he an architect or was he an artist? How did he play into the design of the floor and the other?
He was an artist, not an architect. And I think he actually lived quite close to Gibberd in Essex. I couldnnt tell you a lot more about him other than that, I'm afraid. No. But it was, more sculptural than not a painter like Kerry Richards. He was a sculptor rather than a painter.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, interesting. There's quite an interesting successor, if you like, to that, in that I don't know if people know Tess Duray, who's a sort of abstract painter, designed a floor for St Mary's in Nottingham, which, you know, very simple. Well, she's designed other floors, including, I think, at Victoria Station in London and places. But yeah, interesting.
I think she did the one outside Wakefield Cathedral, didn't she?
Yes, I think you're right. Yes, okay. And the same person asked, what was the spec for the acoustic plaster?
Oh, good question. I could probably find it. This is a little book that Gibberd produced. It's probably in there. It's got a slightly rough texture to it, which helps break up the sound. I couldn't tell you without looking it up, I'm afraid, and it's not on the top of my head.
Perhaps Keith, he can come back to us and we'll be in touch with him. Somebody else asked, has the construction of the building worn well? Have any major repairs arisen? I think you did allude to the fact that you were perhaps going to tell us about that.
Right, there's quite a lot of stories, and some of them are rather tales of woe to do with this. It was experimental and it was cheap. For a cathedral, it was cheap. There was that within 15 years, the technical problems became quite severe. The main ones were the leaking roof. Now you might say, hey, all buildings leak, my house leaks. But it's probably best that it doesn't happen within 10, 15 years of being completed. Now, there's a particular reason for that, which one of the site architects, I went to a lecture by him and he explained what had happened. It's a life story, so I'll tell you. The roof was meant to be aluminium, but it would take about 6 months to put all the aluminium panels on. And the problem is that the aluminium goes on shiny and then it weathers down to a sort of matte finish. And Gibberd was quite keen that it all looked, when it opened in '67, that it should all look the same, that it wouldn't weather, some bits would look weathered in and some bits would look new. And ICI said, we have a wonder material, at which point you should, of course, run for the hills. And they said it's this sort of rubberized sort of sheet that we can put on the aluminium. It'll stop it weathering. And then just before you open, rip it all off and voila, it's all nice and shiny. What happened, of course, was particularly on the south and west facing parts of the roof, ultraviolet light baked this material onto the surface, onto the aluminium, and bonded it onto it. You know, it couldn't be peeled off. So what they had to do with all the happening was send a whole load of guys up there on ropes with basically paint scrapers to scrape it off. And the problem is that aluminium is quite soft. And while they were doing this, every time they were doing it, they were putting little holes in the aluminium. And then the water came in and then it would find its way down and come out at various points. So the roof leaked like a sieve. The Dalle de Verre glass, which is a big problem for the, particularly in the lantern, again, the extreme exposure to the very windy south and west faces and the sea air has degraded it to a certain extent. And again, that leaks. I think there's there's currently a conservation management strategy based on managed leakage, which Purcell's are involved with, the architects and managers.
Yeah.
And the other problem was the mosaic tiles on the ribs
Mm-hmm.
externally. When you look at it now, they look like they're made out of granite, but they're actually concrete clad in mosaic, and they started to drop off. Again, expansion and various problems with mortar. So in the 90s, a massive amount of restoration work was done to the cathedral, which included overcladding the mosaic ribs with a GRP, glass reinforced plastic kind of sheeting, which has made them look a bit chunkier. So yes, there were masses of technical problems with the church, with the building.
Perhaps
that's what happens when you try and do a lot experimentally on very little money.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. We've got a question about, but do you know if Lutyens' commission was based at all on the war commission work he had done following the First World War? Noticed some similarities in the cathedral model with his imposing war monument at Deep Valve.
Yeah, the Deep Valve was definitely the prototype in a way for the interlocking arches was definitely the prototype. As was some of the work at New Delhi. So some of the government buildings, which Lutyens did with Herbert Baker. I don't think Lutyens was totally happy with the outcome. He didn't have a free hand at it. But yes, Deep Valve is definitely the model that he applied and scaled up for the cathedral.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to ask actually, was there a catalogue with the exhibition that you did about the competition for the?
There was, yes, yeah.
Find that on.
There are. I might have 1 or 2 copies left in the office.
Okay, right. Email Dominic if you need. I'd love to see that. I mean, just seeing the 3rd and 2nd place plans that you showed just look so fascinating.
Yeah, it was it got entries from famous modernist architects like Dennis Lasdom, better known for the National Theatre. He did a very beautiful entry. The American architect Peter Eisenman, he got offered his first teaching job at Cambridge on the back of his commended entry. He's still alive, still practicing, and so very fondly remembers the scheme. There were architects from Australia, South Africa, Canada, all over the world, and obviously the 2nd place from Singapore, Malaysia. The majority were essentially, or actually the vast majority were fan-shaped, but there were a few traditional linear ones. Oliver Hill, better known for the Midland Hotel in Morecambe, he designed quite a traditional scheme for it. So there were some great things came to light.
Yeah, interesting. Another quick question: is the Still Point piece outside meant to be an eye? Supposed to be an eye? I think I know the answer to this, in that I think it was shortlisted for our award at one point, and I seem to remember some preliminary drawings that showed the eclipse of the moon. So I think it's more to do with the moon, lunar images there. Sophie's asking, were the artists invited or were there competitions?
Invited.
Invited, yeah.
Yeah, and it was normally a discussion between Gibberd and the committee. Yeah, sure. Somebody went just before 1966 when it was magnificent without all the trimmings. That would have been interesting.
Any photos, Jane? We'd love to see them.
Yeah, that would have been great. I'd love to have seen it, but I'd have only been one.
Yeah. Another question: the strong overall circular floor plan reminds us of the symbology of the Eucharist wafer. Was this an aspect ever considered or highlighted in the design or the inner layout?
Gibberd talks a great deal about his design in the book that he produced, and he doesn't talk about that. He was not. I mean, he says in the book himself, he really didn't understand the liturgy. He was an architect first and foremost. He was an Anglican architect, and so he said anything to do. He said you could have told him that the baptistry had to be stuck on the roof, and he would have followed that instruction. he was being led very much by the dean and chapter or the building committee on sort of those aspects and the symbolism that goes with those operational aspects. He would interpret them in a formal way, but he was doing what he was told in that sense.
Fantastic. Phil is pointing out that the Gibberd's book on the cathedral is available on Abe Books for £20 or so. And I think there was also recently a fairly new monograph on Gibberd, wasn't there? I forget who by, but I think I'm sure.
Was it a C21? I'm not sure. Was it? One of the 20th century series?
It might be Lund Humphreys or
right.
The woman. Anyway, look it up. But yeah, I think there's some good.
Yes, Diane said it was the C21 series.
Okay,
yeah.
Good, excellent. Yeah. I had a quick question also about because I think I got distracted just when you were talking about the baptistry. The silver work on the font itself and on the Paschal candle. Did you say what by, or did I miss it?
Oh gosh, I did know and I can't remember. I'm afraid.
I mean, they look so lovely and kind of very in keeping with the David Atkins.
They
were.
I don't think they were. If you bear with me, I can certainly hang on. I can just check that actually.
Or possibly even Gibberd himself. Okay.
Yeah, he does talk a great deal about the difficulties they had with trying to resolve the pragmatic aspects of the baptismal font without over cluttering it. I'll just see if I can find that for you.
Suggesting it might have been Robert McGee.
That rings a bell.
Spelled G-I-H, G-H-I-E.
I should have bookmarked it. Right, here we go.
Terence, you're the organist there, I think. Is that right? Who's given us some information?
Yes. Terence will have the answer.
Thank you for that.
I found it now, but yeah.
Yes, it was McGee.
It was. Okay, thank you. Someone's speaking to us. Can't tell who it is who's speaking.
Terry Duffy.
Oh, hello. Hi, Terry. It was Robert McGee, was it? Okay, that's great. Thank you. And did he design anything else in the cathedral?
So adjusted a chapel to accommodate the 3 flasks of holy oils.
Okay.
In one of the chapels.
Yeah. With also incorporating silver work. I mean, I don't know anything about him. Was he a silversmith?
No, he was an artist who worked in various forms in Catholic churches generally.
Okay. Thank you. Look him up.
Yeah, Gibberd is actually quite reticent. I don't think he mentions him in his. He's normally very good about mentioning the artists he worked with, but he didn't have him in
No, that was very much a later edition.
Right.
Post completion.
Gibberd wouldn't have written about. Okay. Thank you, and well done to Julie Kershaw for spotting. Knowing. Brilliant. Well, if I think we've. Please shout if we haven't taken your question. I think we have got through them. And it's 8:15. So I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you so much again to Dominic. Really wonderful talk, and look forward to sharing that with others. I might just mention quickly, we've got one more of our talks coming up on the 10th of June. That's Martin Crampin talking about St David's Cathedral in Wales, and in particular the medieval tiles there, and the new project that he's developed, creating new tiles for the cathedral. Also on the 16th of June, we've got an event that we're co-hosting along with the Insiders Outsiders Festival and with St John's Waterloo. It's at St John's Waterloo, but it's also available to attend online. It's called A Jewish Jesus, and it's about art and faith in the shadow of World War II. It has a particular focus on Hans Feibusch, who many of you may know is a painter of Jewish descent who came to Britain and ended up painting more murals for Church of England churches than any other artist. Quite an interesting fact in itself. And Mayor Martin is another artist that we'll be talking about. a really jam-packed program. Do have a look at it. If you just search for Jewish Jesus on Eventbrite or through our website, you'll find it. But we'd love to see you there. So I think that's all I had to say, and I think if you won't mind joining me in a sort of clap, an online clap for Dominic, and a thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay.